Welcome to Poets Have Something to Say. Wow, what a special guest we have. It's a first for the show. We have a National Poet Laureate on with us for our November edition of Poets Have Something to Say. Again, I'm Jeff McAndrew, Poet Laureate of North Fond du Lac. So excited to be joined by Chris Teese, one of New Zealand's most powerful and innovative poetic voices, the country's Poet Laureate from 2022 to 2025. And Chris is known for his fearless and beautiful work exploring identity, love, history, and belonging, poems that challenge us while offering moments of deep connection. And in our conversation today, we hope to talk about his journey as Poet Laureate, the influences that have shaped his writing, and much more. Chris, it's a real honor to have you here on the program, joining us from New Zealand.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Really honored to be here with you today.
Wonderful. I understand you had a poem for us. Can you start us off with a poem today?
Yeah, sure thing. So this is a poem called The Other Side of the Glass, and it was included in my most recent collection, Supermodel Minority, which was published in 2022.
Great.
The Other Side of the Glass. I was working a sausage sizzle fundraiser on the day George Michael died. His ghost sat with me in my car while I scrolled through social media exploding with grief and links to his greatest hits. George took my hand and told me not to cry before asking why I smelt of burning flesh. "Are we in hell?" he asked. "Lower Hutt," I replied. My sunburnt neck pulsed with the residual heat, or perhaps it was the spark of a memory of watching him perform at Sydney Mardi Gras in 2010, flanked by shirtless cowboys, leather daddies, and policemen in latex pants. I think about it all the time. Every now and then, I crave that night again, trepidation running slick down my spine every time I locked eyes with another guy, hoping my smile would be returned favorably. A certain beat can unlock the body heat of that glittering night, and all the other nights of careless yearning since then, tumbling from limb-crushing dance floor into the crisp 3 a.m. air with his voice still ringing in my ears. You've got to go to the city. You've got to reach the other side of the glass. Some of us are neither sunburst nor shade, but a symptom of formative summers caught somewhere in between, like hands pressed against the edge of the rest of our lives. The glass was my own making, and all my future wonders were one swift and decisive thought away. I wrote all my desires in my breath for anyone to read them.
That's amazing. There is a lot there. Thank you for sharing that, Chris.
No problem.
Chris Teese, New Zealand Poet Laureate. Tell me about, obviously you have quite a very interesting journey, and share what you feel comfortable with. But as a queer Chinese New Zealander, that had to be very, very tough at times. Can you tell us a bit about that? I know that's a general question, but...
Yeah, so when I started writing poetry back in high school, I was still closeted. I didn't really want to think too much about that part of myself because I was still sort of figuring it out. And I went to university and decided that I was going to study English literature and creative writing. And that's when I think I was really introduced to what was happening in contemporary New Zealand literature and contemporary New Zealand poetry. And I guess one of the things that really stood out to me was this absence of Chinese New Zealand voices. And for me, it kind of said two things. One, that there wasn't any interest in my stories or my experiences as a Chinese New Zealander, or that no one wanted to publish these stories, so that there wasn't a place for me in our literature. And that kind of really affected how I guess I started writing poetry and the sorts of things that I wrote about. But over time, I eventually came to realize that, this is something that needs to be done, and I sort of made that decision to start writing about the Chinese New Zealand experience and the place of Chinese in New Zealand's history. So that was sort of a big sort of epiphany for me in terms of shaping myself as a writer, because it really did change how I approached not only reading poetry but writing poetry, and I guess what poetry meant to me and the role it plays in my life. And then later, further down the line, that's when I started to sort of be a bit more open about writing, about my sexuality and my queerness, and particularly how the two parts of my identity as a Chinese New Zealander and as a gay man sort of intersect, and the complications and tensions that arise from there. But yeah, I grew up in a pretty big city by New Zealand standards. That did have a very strong Chinese community, and I never really felt like an outsider in that respect, because there were so many Chinese and Asian kids at school, so we were never really sort of, the one Chinese family or the one Chinese kid. Yeah.
So when was it that you knew that you were a poet, that you were?
Well, I started writing poetry because my friends were doing it and I didn't want to miss out.
Okay, fair.
So I was sort of not quite peer pressured, but I thought, well, if they're doing it, I might as well give it a go, because they were sort of bringing their own poems to school to share at lunchtime. And I thought, well, if I want to hang out with my friends, I probably need to start writing some poems just so that I can sort of join in.
Cool.
And I'd always written song lyrics as a kid. I thought, maybe I could be a songwriter and a musician. So it wasn't a massive leap from writing song lyrics to writing poetry. And maybe it was once I got to university and managed to get into one of the undergrad creative writing classes for poetry, which is highly competitive. They only, I think, take about 10 or 12 students each year. I managed to get into one of those, and I thought, okay, maybe I might be okay at this. And from there, that's when I really started to take it a lot more seriously, and ended up doing my master's in creative writing a few years later, which again was another very competitive program. So getting into that program was a really big boost in confidence. But I don't quite know, I guess, the moment that I thought I was a poet. And for me, it's sort of been this gradual journey of little successes here and there that sort of have then led me to where I am today. So, for me, it's still a work in progress. Still have so much to learn. And, I still get a little bit funny about telling people that I'm a poet, because it sort of seems like a really weird, self-indulgent thing to do or to call yourself.
Right.
But I think, especially when I became New Zealand Poet Laureate, I knew I had to sort of break out of that shyness and actually own it and claim it. So, telling people that I was a New Zealand Poet Laureate was a bit of a big deal for me.
That's awesome. We're with New Zealand's Poet Laureate here, Chris Tees. Thanks again for your time today. I have so many questions. I know, and I don't want this show to be political at all, but in the United States, we certainly have this dichotomy with those that are accepting of alternative lifestyles and those that are not accepting. And of course, we have a broad audience here, and I'm sure there are people that listen to our show that are on, that are maybe a little trepidatious about different lifestyles. And what can your poetry bring to sort of bring those sides together? That's probably a question that's too huge to answer, but.
Yeah. So I grew up in the 80s and the 90s here in New Zealand, and it was 1985 that legislation was passed to decriminalise homosexuality here in New Zealand. So, that was a few years after I was born. So in my lifetime, there have been quite significant changes in not only legislation, but also, I guess, in public perceptions of queer people and the queer community.
Yeah.
And, I remember when we went through the changes in legislation for civil unions that would allow same-sex couples to become, civil unioned.
Right.
I don't know if that's the right word.
Sure. Yeah, that is. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, about a decade or so after that, in 2012, is when we had the same-sex marriage legislation passed. And I was a young gay man at that point, and it really, I remember the emotional response that I had to that moment. Surrounded by friends, we watched the parliamentary debate on TV, and it was a really big turning point, I think, for the way queer people are perceived publicly. in New Zealand. And for me, it was kind of like this moment of hope that maybe things were going to get better. And, in some ways things have, because it's amazing for me to go and visit schools and see that they have, queer youth clubs, and, they proudly promote queer books at their school library. That's something that never happened when I was at school. But at the same time, like the United States and everywhere else in the world, there's this resurgence of anti-queer, anti-trans sentiment, and a lot of that has been imported from other countries, and it is a very fringe, vocal minority, but it's enough to gain access to politicians, to gain headlines and exposure, and then that upsets that balance, that we have, if we even had that balance in the first place. So it is a really strange time, I think, to be going through a lot of that again. And one of the things that we always see is that they kind of deploy the same tactics and the same arguments over and over again. But I think what's really wonderful is that we do have allies stepping up to support queer and trans communities, to sort of push back against that rhetoric. And I think that's something that we had back in like the 80s and the 90s when all that other stuff was happening, but it really was like sticking your head above the parapet back then, and it wasn't as visible. Whereas now it feels like at least people understand that it's not right to attack that part of such a small part of our community.
And I want to emphasize on my podcast, we don't discriminate against any viewpoints. Any viewpoint is welcome, and especially with a poetry podcast, we don't want to be getting political. But it is interesting where with the world becoming, it seems like more authoritarian, and I'll leave it at that. We have an interesting president. I'll leave it at that here in the States. But it seems like there's more anti-trans. That seems to rise with authoritarian regimes. Or is that something that gives you trepidation? The rise of authoritarian governments in the world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And being here in New Zealand, we're not immune to any of that.
Right.
It's like the butterfly effect, right? Like what happens elsewhere in the world does have an effect in the far reaches and in the little corners that you don't really think about too much. And yeah, I guess for me, I was actually in the States in Iowa City when you had your election, and it was quite interesting being an outsider, seeing the responses and seeing how people were feeling, following the results of the election when Trump got re-elected. And it was, it kind of made, it put a lot into perspective for me, and it was really interesting being able to talk to people directly about it, because we obviously only see what makes it onto the news and the headlines, and how it gets reported here has its own sort of take. But I guess going back to your question about poetry, and what I hope my own poetry do, for me, poetry has always been a way to help myself understand the world, and B, to help create conversations. And I know I can only say so much, and I only bring a very particular perspective or point of view to my own work. But I hope that at least it's a way of getting other people to maybe think about things differently, or to have those conversations either with me or with other people in their lives. And yeah, poetry is this beautiful platform to be able to do that in different ways. It can be quite confrontational, or it can be sort of a little bit more gentle, and sort of ease people into that space.
Right, I agree that poetry can be a platform to at least be a conduit for conversation starters, to get us to think perhaps more creatively, or maybe about political issues, or creatively about our lives, maybe creatively about our relationships, or maybe even, as we were speaking about earlier, more creative about getting along together in this world. How our if we're going to remain polarized, we're not going to make much progress.
Yeah, and I mean, I do realize sometimes that being a poet and being in a pretty liberal city here in Wellington, I do live in a bit of a bubble. A lot of my friends are left-leaning, and we all believe in the same things. So sometimes it's I have to remind myself that I need to at least open myself up to other ways of seeing the world and other ways of thinking, to be able to understand where other people are coming from, and to be able to then sort of see those gaps and see where we might need to be bridging things to move forward together.
Yeah, I think that's the paradigm, the paradox, I guess, is that unless we do try to reach across and talk to people different than us, and it's hard to do. We all have our groups, and it's hard to do. But I had a talk with a relative about that who said, "Well, I just hang out with people I know," But I think maybe it's healthy to reach across the aisle and see what the other people are doing.
And I think it's that willingness that often frustrates me, or that lack of willingness.
Yeah.
You have people that are so set in their thinking, or absolutely do not want to have anything to do with breaking out of their bubble. That really frustrates me.
Yeah, yep, I'd agree. And I think poetry can carry us in creative ways, carry us to greater heights, to try to maybe understand each other a little bit more. We're in just the final moments here with New Zealand's Poet Laureate, Chris T's. It has gone really fast. How do people get a hold of your works? Do you have a website?
Yeah, so I've got a website. It's christeese.co.nz. There's lots of links to journals and places where my poetry has been published. If you search for me, it's pretty easy to find my work. There is, however, a Canadian Chris Teese who is also a poet, so just be aware that there are actually two of us out there.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah.
The New Zealand one. But other than that, I do have 3 collections available. Unfortunately, I'm not published outside of New Zealand, so it can be a little bit difficult to get some of my books overseas, but you definitely can. It just might cost you a little bit extra. But yeah, it's out there.
Sounds great. Do you have a poem to take us out of the show today?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really lovely to chat with you.
Me too.
And I wish you all the best in your term as Poet Laureate.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. Thank you.
So I'll finish off with this poem that I wrote a couple of years ago for an event, and it's sort of become one of my favourite new poems that I've written recently. This is called "It Wasn't a Phase, Mum. I Still Listen to Celine Dion."
Okay, good.
I'm almost the same age you were when I asked you to bring back a copy of Falling Into You from one of your long weekends in Melbourne. I could have asked for a boomerang, but I didn't, because I was very gay. I thrashed that album, dubbed a copy for the car, and belted its songs in the shower until they became hymns of steam and soap. At 41, you were a mother of 2 teenage boys and a small business owner. At 41, I am a childless poet with stacks of CDs I can't play anymore. These days, my fingers search soju sticky karaoke catalogues for Celine's deep cuts, while time plays its circular tricks on me in darkened rooms of deja vu. Everything comes back to trend. Everything is in fashion again to remind us how many times we have danced around the sun. I've lost count of how many parties I've passed through, like Marty McFly, desperate for home, dazed and careless, my youth trickling away in friends of friends' flats, thick with smoke and bass. I sought reprieve in kitchens where everyone bluffed their way through conversations that felt epiphanous in the moment, their bravado on full display for anyone who might meet them, vibe to vibe. Remember that night R punched a concrete wall just because someone told him to? The party inside carried on despite his cries of pain. Someone put on a dance remix of My Heart Will Go On as a joke, but the whole house shook with the drunken conviction of 30 theatre students. Nowadays, I walk past that same house with students crouched outside, passing a precious joint between them. The walls talk to those who have spoken to them. The years are always waiting for someone to hit play again.
Beautiful. Chris Tees, thank you very much for joining us today on Poets Have Something to Say. It's a complete honor, and would love to talk to you a couple years down the road, see how you're doing.
It would be great. Thank you for having me, Jeffrey.
All right, fantastic. That's Poets Have Something to Say. Chris Tees, the New Zealand Poet Laureate. And thank you again for joining us here on the program. That's the November edition of Poets Have Something to Say.